everybody. I am Joe Marcello, joined as always by my bandit brothers, Orrin Phillips.
Hey, everybody.
And Mike Farah.
Howdy.
Well, it's that time of week again. I don't know where you live, but depending on where it is, you may call it Hump Day. You may just call it Wednesday, but we call it Dollar Bin Bandit Day. And today we are proud to bring to you an interview with who I consider comic book royalty. We have been on a roll lately. We have been interviewing some really great guests. And today we are proud to bring to you our interview with Chuck Dixon. Now, Chuck has had a really fantastic career. I think he's worked everywhere. So many different comic book publishers, so many characters, and just great stories all around.
Yeah, I'm going to go for the low-hanging fruit right now and talk about Bane, a character he helped create, and a pivotal character in the history of Batman. And very interesting to hear his stories about how that character and that whole Nightfall series was put together.
Yeah, he was also huge for the Punisher and Batman, and in fact, basically willed that crossover into existence. The Punisher. Batman crossover, and did a bunch of work with Tim Drake on Robin, not work with Tim Drake, on Tim Drake in Robin, those miniseries that came out right after the character debuted, highly successful, and just done a lot, as Joe and Orrin have attested to. So let's hear from the man himself. This is Chuck Dixon.
Thank you so much for being on with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
I want to start because you cut your teeth with three of my favorite independent books, which is Eclipse, First, and Comico, which I think are criminally underrated when it comes to 80s independent books. How was your experience there, and how did that help you in your writing?
Well, it's Comico because it was founded by a bunch of Italian guys. Yeah, Comico was easy for me because it was within driving distance of my house in Pennsylvania. So I was able to actually go there and pester them for work. They were interesting guys. They were basically just comic nerds who decided to start their own company. They'd gotten a windfall of money from somewhere, and they actually had an office and everything. So trying to act professional, but a lot of times it felt like a frat house. But yeah, they were pretty cool until I had to sue them over creator ownership.
Jeez. Right.
And their oldest brother was an attorney, so that got rough. But
gotcha.
But yeah, I liked all those guys, despite the legal hassles. And then of course Eclipse was a trip working there. Kat and Dean were just, they're characters, and I say that in the best possible sense. So.
And did you have creative freedom there that you could pretty much write what you liked, or?
Yeah, I mean, Dean and his brother Jan were early proponents of creator-owned comics. I mean, they were really the crusaders. I mean, today, if you sign a creator-owned contract, it's thanks to Jan and Dean because they created it. I mean, when I worked at Epic under Archie Goodwin, the creator-owned contract there was identical to Dean's contract at Eclipse. So IDW has the exact same contract. Now the wording is exactly the same. So they were real pioneers. And I liked working with Kat. She was my editor most of the time. And she was a self-avowed communist. And I'm not. And we had these great conversations, but it was terrific because it never led to any kind of personal animosity. We just loved arguing with one another.
Right.
So, but yeah, it was, it was a great time. I mean, you're living through, a lot of times, you're having a great time. You don't realize how great a time you're having. You look back years later, but I knew I was having a great time when I was working there.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty special. I agree. I never look back and I mean, I always look back and feel like I had a good time, but in the moment to have that is a pretty special experience. So I wanted to move on to your experience, your lengthy experience with one Mr. Tim Drake,
Yes.
Otherwise known as Robin,
Right.
among many other names as he's progressed, but I'll always know him as Robin. So you didn't necessarily create the character itself, but you certainly defined him over, more than 100 issues of the regular series, and previous to that, the 3 miniseries. With so much of that experience with one character under your belt, do you know him better than yourself at this point?
Yeah, he definitely lives in my mind. I felt like I understood him. That's the key to writing a character. You've got to invest yourself in it to the point where they seem real to you in your head, so that you pretty much can anticipate what they'll do in any given situation. But you can't make them tedious. It still has to surprise the reader. So you hold things back that about them that the reader doesn't. But yeah, I mean, and you're right. I didn't create Tim Drake, but Denny O'Neil kind of tasked me with making him popular. So his words of advice were, make him as different from Jason Todd as you possibly can. And that's what I did. But it was based on the groundwork by Marv Wolfman and of course Alan Grant, who did a fantastic job of evolving him to the point where I took him over.
Yeah, that seemed like almost a seamless handoff, because the character came, I think, right out of the gate, really well defined, or at least comparatively to the previous Robins. But I think you heightened it to such a degree that became so much more relatable, at least to those who sort of grew up with Tim Drake as our Robin, so to speak, when we were in the comics.
Well, I mean, I had the luxury of, I was given, Tim Drake had more stage time with me because he wasn't sharing his book with anybody. Right. So I had the luxury of being able to build him. But, I'm glad you said seamless, because I'm an invisible hand writer. I don't want, I didn't want a sudden like, oh, this is my Tim Drake. Forget what happened before. I was continuing what Marv and Alan started.
Well, that was great. I think you certainly did your job there with the invisible hand. Not to be, I think sometimes it gets a little overwrought if you're trying to be showy, and especially at the beginnings of a character and developing them. Yeah. So let me ask you, do you feel, having had so much experience with Tim Drake, do you feel protective of him as a character? Even when you were maybe writing him, if someone were to have him as a guest star, or even now where his character is gone?
When I was on the books, and other people would use him, I think he was well defined enough that they didn't vary much. I never saw a project where I said, "No, that's not right." I think everybody got the character. It wasn't that difficult. As far as after I stopped writing the books, character belongs to DC. I don't have any proprietorship. It's kind of like watching your kids go away with another guy, with a stepdad, but you just have to let it go.
Yeah, another creator compared it to ex-girlfriends. You just want to let them go instead of friending them on Facebook.
Yeah, you don't want to be thinking about it, and quite frankly, I'm a professional writer. I'm not paid to think about it anymore.
Yeah. Agreed.
I don't.
That said, I will sneak this question in because it's been in the news. Yes. The revelation of Tim Drake's sexuality or fluidity, however you want to characterize that. I'm sure you saw the articles. What are your thoughts on that direction? And were there any seeds you planted, or maybe even didn't plant, so that might be possible in the future?
No, I never planted any seeds like that. I didn't really deal, someone today asked me the difference between, a romantic relationship in fiction and a sexual relationship in fiction. And my relationships are always romantic in, majority of them. The only sexually active characters that I wrote were Conan and Frank Castle. The others, it was up to you whether or not they were sexually active. It's like the old movie where they fade to black, and
right.
And then when we come back, they're eating breakfast together but wearing different clothes. And you're like, well, did they or didn't they? It's up to you as the consumer. But it wasn't built into the character for me. And to my mind, it's just a cynical ploy, cynical marketing ploy, to create this unnecessary controversy. If you wanted a bi character, create a new one. Don't keep changing characters that we already know.
Right.
And plus, the greater thing is that people project themselves on these characters. I remember when I was working on Robin, Jordan Gorfinkel was one of my editors, and he told me that when he was a kid, he could project on all of his favorite characters that they were Jewish, because he was Jewish, and then he could relate to that. And he said he's always disappointed when a character that he liked, it was established that what religion they were. Like, you see them going to church, and you go, oh, well, that's, Peter Parker's not Jewish anymore in my mind. And I really was cognizant of that as I wrote Robin. And I never established anything like that, because I never established anything that would prevent the reader from projecting themselves on him. And I think it's wrong to change characters like that, especially this character's been around a long time now, even though he's still young. It just seems wrong to make a sea change like that.
Right. I want to go. Oh, you did.
Go ahead, Or.
No, I was just going to jump quickly to another character in the news, Moon Knight, that you worked on.
Yeah.
So early 80s, there's a run of the book, kind of go, it wasn't a big seller. Some time goes by, they bring it back. What were your thoughts on the original run and the character itself?
I liked the character,
Yeah.
And I liked everything about it. It was pretty cool. I mean, I remember buying the issues of the Hulk magazine,
right?
And Moon Knight was the backup. And I mostly bought them for the Moon Knight stories. Now, when they asked me to do Moon Knight, it was Carl Potts was the editor,
right?
And he personally didn't like the multi-personality angle, so he asked me to get rid of that and just have it be Mark Spector, who was a mercenary, which at the time was kind of like a cool thing. So we just leaned into that. I didn't know that it would result in Doug Mensch being angry at me about it because it's like, it was an editorial decision. It wasn't my choice to do that, so we just sort of leaned into the mercenary angle. But yeah, I did it for 2 years until they switched editors on me, and my new editor was driving me insane. Eventually I had to leave the book.
Got you. But is it strange kind of taking over a book like that someone sort of set the groundwork not that long ago, and then you kind of come in and, not reboot it, but kind of reboot it?
Well, yeah, you kind of have to look at it and say, anytime I'm asked to take over a book, you want to write Green Arrow, you want to do this. I said, well, let me think about it. I never automatically say yes. And I have to think about it and say, well, am I going to bring anything to this party? Is this a character I can invest myself in? Because if it's not, then I'm going to do my second best work, and I don't want to do that.
Right.
But when Carl presented it to me and the angle he wanted to take, I thought, well, this actually makes Moon Knight more in my wheelhouse, because we've got this military angle. And then my main interest in taking the book over is so that I could do crossovers with the Punisher. Because I really wanted to write the Punisher. So I kind of showed Don Daly that I could write the Punisher by having him guest star in Moon Knight as frequently as I could.
So for you, it was the audition for the Punisher to show, hey, I could do a vigilante in a city and have action and have a story as well.
Yeah, and also it was kind of practice for writing Batman, which I didn't know I was ever going to do.
Right. But for you, moving from Moon Knight to Punisher, what did you want to bring to the Punisher book that maybe wasn't there in the past for you as a fan?
I really didn't want to bring anything to it that wasn't already there. I just wanted to, play in that playground. Right. I mean, for me, two stories defined the Punisher for me. There was a Denny O'Neil Spider-Man annual, I think it was, that Frank Miller drew.
Right.
And at the end of the story, Frank is arrested and they're going to send him to prison. Mm-hmm. And he's like, great, there's lots of criminals there. And I'm like, oh, wow, that is so sick. And then Mike Barron wrote a story that really crystallized the character for me, in which Frank keeps going to his entourage of support characters looking for help with a particular mission. Mm-hmm. And none of them are able to provide him what he needs. And in each case, he says, well, if you can't help me, then what good are you? And ultimately, he says this to Microchip. And I'm like, what a prick this guy is. I love him. I want to write this character so bad because he's just got nothing to recommend him. He's the villain in his own book. He's got every negative male stereotype. And what a blast that would be to write. And so I just kept pestering Don Daly till he gave me a shot.
And it was the run that you had on it everything you wanted it to be?
Yeah, I got to do a lot of really cool stuff. I just regret that there were 2 unpublished projects. I did a Punisher, the Savage Land Marvel oversized things, and it never got published. And then we were going to do a second Punisher Western with art by Russ Heath, and he completed about half the artwork before it got canceled.
Yeah.
So, but otherwise, yeah. And then there was a thing with Johnny Romita Jr. and I wanted to do a story where Frank gets committed to an insane asylum, and by Micro, and I really wanted to, but we never got to it.
Oh man.
Oh, that's a shame.
Oh, and I should say there was yet another project. And it was going to be me and Rodolfo DiMaggio, and it took place at the time of the handover of Hong Kong to China.
Okay.
And it involved Fing Fang Foom.
Man, oh man. So what? I mean,
Punisher seems like this malleable, on the surface, a completely like strict, straight ahead, vigilante, getting the criminals, and yet you and even other writers put him in such weird circumstances that I think that's the fish out of water kind of thing. Really, kind of jazzes him up.
Well, I mean, the whole time I was on the Punisher, I mean, Don Daly let me do anything, but even he had lines he wouldn't cross. And I wanted to have Punisher fight Ulick the Troll so bad. I wanted to set up a situation. I finally got to do it in Marvel Knights, and I really ticked off Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti because they hated the whole idea, but they let me do it, and I'm still glad I did it. It's an epic scene, and so that's the great thing. The best Punisher stories aren't about the Punisher. It's just a really cool story that the Punisher is inserted into.
Right.
It's like this situation isn't bad enough. Here comes Frank Castle to make everything worse.
What was I have to ask, what was the kernel of the story for Frank in the Savage Land?
He infiltrates Hydra looking for some particular guy, and he basically joins Hydra's mercenary army, and him and a bunch of other new recruits are drugged, and they wake up in the Savage Land, and they're protecting their Hydra is mining for petroleum and rare earth metals in the Savage Land. And then Frank eventually is exposed as the Punisher. He escapes, and he forms a coalition of tribes, primitive tribes, that attack the Hydra complex and destroy it.
I like it.
And of course, there's tons of dinosaurs and saber-tooth tigers. Gary Quapis drew it. It was gorgeous. Just he is so good at the organic stuff with the animals and everything.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was a lot of fun. You can see it on my website. I think most of the pages are there. ChuckDixon.net.
Right.
Awesome.
I was just going to ask real quick, so what happens when you have the story and you have the art, and then it doesn't get the green light? Is there a chance for it to come back at a later date, or is it just when it's squashed there?
Apparently, once it's killed, it's killed. They don't bring it back. I mean, DC had a policy for a long time of inventory issues. So every year I would write 13 issues of whatever comic I was on. And it was an issue intended to be put in the drawer in case we ran into deadline problems. And we never ran into deadline problems. So I have all these stories that were never published. I have all these Jim Aparo Batman stories that were never published. And I don't know why. I mean, it's material, at least digitize it, do something with the material.
Yeah.
But I've got quite a few Punisher things that never got published, like short, because Don was always, you write me a 5-page story, write me a 4-page story, write me a 3-page story, and a lot of those never got published. He just had them in his drawer in case he needed to fill space somewhere.
Wow.
But why they don't, I think it's not my, it's a case of it's not my idea. You know, it's like in Hollywood where if they change studio heads, the new studio heads cancels everything in production because they weren't his idea. And when Don Daly got fired at Marvel, along with a lot of other editors, they just simply, you know, tossed everything in his file drawers as if it never happened.
That's
a waste.
It's insane. I mean, like when I was fired off of Batman and the Outsiders, they and Robin simultaneously during a brief return to DC, I write way ahead. So when they fired me, they had about $30,000 in scripts in their drawers that were never going to be drawn.
That's ridiculous, man.
It is. It is.
Yeah,
it doesn't make any
wasteful.
sense. Yeah,
You know that. Go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of makes you realize, you know, how the companies are where they are now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we run into this in virtually every interview. The more sense it makes to writers and artists to go their own way or go with a third party that gives them some sort of control or ownership over their own characters, because the main two are so wasteful and also protective, seemingly, to the point that it squashes creativity. Which, you know, is probably necessary given that they're now multimedia characters and there's so much money riding on the line, but it's obviously disappointing from a fan perspective that we can't get anything new and creative because, you know, it's not allowed.
Well, you know, it's all about the illusion of change with the iconic legacy characters. You know, there's only so much you can do with them or should do with them, but you got to find people that can work within that format to do surprising, engaging. I mean, once upon a time, the comic books audience turned over every few years as the readership outgrew comics and new kids came up to read them. It hasn't been that way in 30 years now. It's the same readership. Yeah. So you know, it's harder and harder to, you know, keep these characters juiced up.
Well, let's talk about a time when there was a lot of juice around a character.
Yeah.
And that was Batman and the Nightfall story. So from my understanding, and you can certainly correct me, is that you were sort of, there was a kernel of a story or an event that was supposed to happen, and you were brought in to sort of develop and then write parts of the issues, which were all obviously integrating with each other on the titles. Can you tell us, you know, what the conception of Nightfall was and how you came in and what your sort of role was in that story?
Well, I was like a utility writer at the time. I was just doing Robin miniseries. I didn't have regular work. I think I had done one Batman arc. And then he invited me to this Bat Summit, which I'd always heard about. And it turned out to be even more than I'd ever heard. You know, they took us to this resort up on the Hudson River, the old Biddle estate. We met in a room that was like right out of Sherlock Holmes. It was like this library room in this estate, you know, built by a robber baron. And then he laid Nightfall out for us, like over the course of a whole morning. And it was all of his editors and Doug Mensch, Alan Grant, myself. And the whole time I'm like, why am I here? I'm just a Robin guy. You know, I don't have a regular title. And when we broke for lunch, Denny asked me to hold back a little bit and the others went off to lunch. And he said, would you like to take over Detective Comics? And I'm like, yeah, would I? Yeah, I think I would. So when we came back in the afternoon, I felt more involved, but he laid it all out in like grand, like mythic terms. And then in the afternoon, we began breaking it down because he had the, you know, Nightfall began a long time before the readers knew we were up to anything. If you look at like the prelude to Nightfall, it's not evident we're going anywhere with the stories, but when you read them in hindsight, you see, oh my gosh, they were laying the groundwork here, you know, for what was to come. Mm-hmm. And then we began working with the whiteboards. We had all these whiteboards and began laying out, you know, the escape from Arkham and all that stuff. but we didn't get around to Bane. We knew we needed a new villain. Denny said we need a new villain, but that's all we knew, and we were sort of working blind on that angle. So most of the first summit was just setting up Nightfall, but it was all Denny. I mean, he said, we're going to have X amount of months of this, X amount of months of that, and then Bruce Wayne's going to be incapacitated for a year and a half. So it was like. And our goal, Denny said, our stated goal was to convince the readers that this change was permanent. So, which I immediately said, well, there's a danger there because what if they actually like this new guy better? And so we realized we had to work hard to make sure he wasn't likable. And we did our job way too well because sales plummeted. And we actually had to cut it short.
Okay.
And bring Bruce back quicker. And that's when we had Dick Grayson stand in. So,
right.
And that brought sales back up.
So among the elements of the story, it sounds like there was Batman or Bruce Wayne was going to be incapacitated. Was there a specific method involved at that point, like the breaking of the back, or did that come later?
It was definitely going to be breaking the back, to which, I was like, well, we got to work this out medically. So it seems plausible that he could return, because this kind of spinal injury, it's a wheelchair forever for somebody. And with the help of my sister-in-law, who's a registered intensive care nurse, I was able to figure out, what would have to happen right after his back was broken in order to have him come back and be Batman again one day. So it was things like that, that logistic stuff fascinates me. And I always feel it's important to have in the stories. There's some level of believability to these crazy wish fulfillment fantasies.
Right.
So, but yeah, it was pretty much, Denny was very specific about what had to happen and how. I mean, like we knew that the new villain had to be Batman's superior and intellectual equal, and that he had to be addicted to venom. Those two things were built in, but that's all we knew at the beginning.
I was gonna ask that. So how did you then crack Bane or come up with him as the vehicle for those sort of criteria?
Well, we were getting closer and closer to when we would have to bring Bane on stage. Like, at this point, he had no name. We called him Doc Toxic just to have something to call him. And nobody was ever serious about that being his name. But so we were getting closer and closer, but our next summit was several months away, and we couldn't wait because we were getting too close. And so I was living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at the time, and they wanted me to come up for a mini summit, just come up to the DC offices for a few days. And I said, I can't do it because my wife is going to have a baby. She's due in like 2 weeks. So they came to me. They came and they stayed in a Holiday Inn in Lancaster, and we worked it out there. And on the first day Denny said, our first order of agenda is to create this villain. And I said, and I was the first one to say, well, for this stunt to work, this villain has got to catch on. The readers have to respond to it. And how do you do that? How do you create a character that's made to be popular, that's made to be accepted? I said, this is going to be a lot of work. We're going to have to put a lot of work into this character. And then he says, well, if you think it's going to be that hard, then you do it. He just sent me home, these directives, create this villain. And I knew Graham Nolan was going to draw the origin. And so I called Graham and started bouncing ideas back and forth. Graham came up with the luchador look because we figured out he should be from Central America because that's where Venom came from, the island of Santa Prisca.
I see.
So he's like, and then I began thinking, I read an article in the newspaper about in North Korea, if your father's guilty of a crime, but they can't catch him, they can put you in jail.
Oh, wow.
And you can serve his sentence. And I thought, well, what would that be like? If you were a son serving a sentence for your father's crimes. Right. And then I thought, well, what if you weren't even born yet? What if you were born to a life sentence? Yeah. What kind of animal would come out of that if they survived to adulthood?
Right.
And I thought, well, that's great because that mirrors Bruce Wayne's origin. You know, his character grows out of childhood trauma, and Bane has an ongoing, years-long childhood, his whole
life
trauma every day. And I thought, well, that mirrors it. And you throw in elements of Man in the Iron Mask and stuff like that, and it came out the other side. And then as I was thinking of the character, I called DC. I looked through a thesaurus. I said, what are we going to call this guy? Right. So I went to the thesaurus, looked up evil, and there's Bane. I was like, man, that's a great name. So I called DC offices and said, I want to call him Bane. And they said, well, we hate that. And remember, this was the time of Image when it was all these combined names. Shadow Stalker, and, whatever, Night Hunter, things like that. And I was like, I don't want one of those forgettable, disposable names. I want something succinct. So they said, well, we hate that name. And I said, well, just think about it for a few days. And then 3 days later, everybody was calling him Bane.
Nice.
I just have a quick question with two things real quick. First, when you come up with Bane, did you see him as a long-term character that can last, through the years? Or is this someone who is good for the book right now, and then we'll see what happens as time goes by?
Well, that was the aim. Denny said he wanted us to create a character that would be a permanent member of Batman's Rogues Gallery.
Okay.
And I'm like, whoa, that's a tall order. Because how many forgettable, Kite Man and Calendar Man and all these, crappy one-off, Batman villains. How many lasted? Previous to Bane, I think the ventriloquist was the only one that was added to the canon that had any kind of legs.
Right.
And that's why I was so adamant. We're gonna have to work really hard to make this guy. We can't just, phone this in. Right. If you want a character, a villain that's going to last beyond this stunt, and I had no idea that he would last beyond this stunt to this extent,
right.
To where, I've got 2 shelves full of action figures behind me. They're all Bane. So, I guess, we succeeded there as well because we made him indelible. And I still can't get my head around that he's up there with Joker and Riddler and Catwoman.
Well, I was going to say, if you had been told, okay, we have to go with an established character, so fans, can sort of see that this is the culmination of their feud, who would you have picked from his gallery?
Well, the only characters that could have fit the bill, and these were discussed, but they were discussed in a way that we got to eliminate them.
Right.
There was KG Beast, who certainly was the intellectual and physical equal of Bruce Wayne. But the KGB was over with by this point. As someone said, it was the KG used to be.
Yeah.
So the character was irrelevant, as cool a character as he was.
Right.
And then there was Killer Croc. But Killer Croc wasn't worthy enough. He's just a beastly character. Was Batman really going to be defeated by Killer Croc? No.
Right.
No. But we needed someone that was a super duper threat. Mm-hmm. And, Bane fits the bill. He was created to bring down Batman.
I find that also fascinating, and also that if you had the assignment of coming up with a character that's going to last and that's going to be a threat to Batman and become part of this pantheon of villains, and you did it, but the sort of assignment was like, let's just flip one off, it'll be easy, and no, it's really hard. Otherwise, they would be coming up every issue.
Yeah, because I pointed out that look at all the popular characters that were created as a gesture, were created as one-offs. Silver Surfer was created so Galactus had someone to talk to.
Right.
Wolverine was a one-off Hulk villain
mm-hmm.
in a long string of one-off Hulk villains.
Right.
Hulk fought a new villain every month for years, but Wolverine, is still with us. And the readers are the ones that tell you what's popular and what's not. But we didn't have that luxury. We had to create a guy that would engage from the beginning.
Yeah.
So we put the sweat into it.
So closing out some questioning around Nightfall and KightsEnd. Obviously, the inheritor of the Batman mantle was Azrael, and I'd love to hear, if that was sort of part of the original pitch, or how that was intended to develop, and did it all go to plan, other than what you've already said about sort of cutting it short? But I thought it was very interesting, even from a visual standpoint, how he continued to augment the costume until it became more Azrael-like, or an amalgam of Azrael and Batman. But I do find that period pretty fascinating as well. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I mean, yeah, as you know, we knew Bruce Wayne was going to be replaced by John Paul Valley, and we knew that Denny was going to create it. And we had that Azrael miniseries to set him up, and all that was baked in, and that's who would be replacing him, and that Azrael would be a flawed character, deeply flawed character. He is so much a Denny character, right? The kind of character, sort of his moral compass is all over the place. He suffers from Catholic guilt, you know, all of these things, and you know, and Denny didn't even realize how Denny a character Azrael was. So we all just pointed it out to him that, you know, it isn't an insult. It's just like a look into Denny's psyche. And look at all the characters you write. There's a theme amongst all of them. As different as one is from the other, there's this common theme. And Denny had to admit to it. I at one point I said, "Were you a big fan of the show Have Gun Will Travel?" And he was like, "Oh, I love that show." I said, "Yeah, I knew it." His Paladin is a conflicted character with a dark past. Denny O'Neil all over the place.
So you're saying he had a type?
Yeah, he had a type he liked to write about. I think we all do it, but it's unconscious.
When you're tasked with, and just one last thing with Batman, with the Batman, Punisher, and Batman Spawn. Is it tough playing with other people's figures, you know, were they very protective of their characters and things had to be kind of even, or were you allowed to do as you liked?
Well, Batman Spawn was, I think it was like our third summit, and Denny brought up Batman Spawn, that we were going to be doing that. And he wanted to split it between the three regular writers, because he said it's not fair to just give it to one of you, because it's going to be a royalty payer, and it was. Yeah. And so he wanted to split it between the three of us. But the problem is that either we had never read it or we had tried to read it. And none of us got it. And we actually, you know, on the first day of the summit, we went out for lunch. We went to the town for lunch. We went by our comic shop and bought some issues. Yeah. And we couldn't make heads or tails of the character. We didn't know where to start. And so Doug volunteered to call Todd. And he called Todd, you know, like that evening, and came back with a legal pad, crowded with notes the next morning. And he explained the character to us as best he could from what Todd told him. And, you know, a lot of Spawn was in Todd's head. Wasn't necessarily in the comics, but it was in his head. Mm-hmm. And he was holding a lot back. So Doug explained the character to us, and Alan and I were like, okay, you know, and I think it was Doug and Alan who came up with the basic plot of it. Okay. And then to figure out who was going to write what, we drew names from a hat. and Doug's name was drawn first, so he got to write the beginning. Mine was in the middle. I got to write the middle. Alan got to write the conclusion. Right. And that's how it worked out. And my only questions were, will Todd allow us to have Batman make fun of Spawn's cape? Okay. And can I have Spawn introduce himself as, "You can call me Al"? And Todd said yes to both of them. So I was happy.
That's awesome. Yeah. At least Todd had a good sense of humor.
Oh yeah,
about those things.
No, he was great to deal with. You know, Batman Punisher was different experience, because I had campaigned to have a Batman Punisher crossover for years, like 2 years prior. And Tom DeFalco's thing was always, well, what's in it for us? And Don Daly and I would explain, well, Batman's sales are like 3 times what the Punisher's is. So that's what's in it for us. And then when push came to shove and it was time to do it, Tom DeFalco, who I like, I was friends with and everything else, he said, I don't think Chuck's a hot enough writer right now to write it. And Don said, have you seen the Diamond 100 recently? Because we were Nightfall. I mean, I wrote 6 of the top 10 books on the Diamond 100 a couple of months in a row. Right. Because Nightfall was hot. So they let me write it. And it was a career highlight. I had fun on every single page. And Archie Goodwin was my editor. So I was in total heaven.
You had experience with both of those books. I don't see how that was such an impediment. I mean, even though it was a wrong premise, but
yeah,
you just seemed like the natural fit for that. And you were the one who was, politicking for it.
Yeah, and I was burning to write that scene where the Joker realizes the Punisher's going to kill him.
Right.
It was just, sometimes you get these things in you and they're just eating a hole in you that you want to write them so bad. Because I wanted to do that whole psychological profile the Joker does on the 2 characters and all that stuff. And I just really wanted to get to that. And the one punch fight that the 2 of them have.
I just have a quick Punisher question for you. And that is, because it's very interesting. You said that Batman was really outselling the Punisher at the time. Do you think the Punisher, after you left, was a bit overexposed? Because I remember he was guest starring in almost any book that they could come up with. He was showing up in. And do you think people got a little tired of it?
Well, it's weird. The Punisher sold more when he was a guest star than he did in his own books. I never understood that. And I should have understood it at the time, that the Punisher needed a regular adversary, not necessarily a villain. And Garth Ennis was the one who broke that code. He gave him a law enforcement guy, his own Javert to hunt him down.
Right.
A cop trying to catch the Punisher. And it's like, and when I saw that, I was like, that's the one thing I didn't think of. That's the one thing I wish I had done, was given him a law enforcement adversary. And so that, people wanted to see Punisher with Spider-Man or Punisher with Wolverine more than they wanted to see Punisher by himself for some reason.
Okay.
And then the overexposure, I mean, they kind of killed the Punisher character off when they decided. I remember the editor, when we switched editors after Don got fired, and we basically ended the series, all the series, and they wanted to start it up again. And the new editor said, well, I want to do a kinder, gentler Punisher. And I'm like, well, what does that look like? Right. And he said, well, he maims his victims rather than killing them. And I said, and you think that's kinder and gentler? It's like, I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to put you in a wheelchair for the rest of your life. Right. I said, that's
a bit oxymoronic.
Yeah. I said, now you're turning the Punisher into a sadist, which he never was. I said, I mean, I had Punisher torture people, but they only thought they were being tortured. I mean, I would come up with these different scenes where they thought that he was torturing them. I mean, he wasn't. He was being, he was psychologically tormenting them, maybe. But I said the character was never sadistic. He never enjoyed what he was doing.
Right.
So, but and then the sales, and then they did Ghostbusters Punisher. I mean, they just they did everything they could to try to kill the franchise.
Yeah, Archie Punisher and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh God, I was so angry when they did Archie Punisher. I called Don Daly and I said, I've been trying to do this Batman Punisher crossover for years, and Punisher's crossover debut is with the Riverdale characters. I mean, are you serious?
Well, on a lighter note, The Simpsons, you get to handle one of the most legendary shows on television. And when tell me how that all came together.
Well, Bongo, the people at Bongo, once a year were hiring comic book professionals who hadn't worked on The Simpsons to do guest slots in the Treehouse of Horror special every Halloween. And they got around to inviting me. And so I did one, and I enjoyed it so much that when I was done with it, I said, could I pitch some more Simpsons stories? I said, I really liked writing these characters. Yeah. And they said, sure. So that's how it happened. And I wasn't like a regular, but whenever I would come up with an idea, or more frequently, my wife would come up with an idea for a plot line. She would always start with, did they ever do this? And that would, I would pitch that idea and they would say yes or no. But I agree. And every once in a while they would come to me and say, well, we need a 5-pager here, or would you want to do something for a winter special or a Christmas special? That kind of thing. But mostly it was just me pitching, what if they did this? What if they did that?
If they had invited you, and I'm sure the answer is yes, would you have loved to write for the program itself?
Yeah, I probably would have taken a whack at it, though I hate writing TV movie stuff. It's not my thing. I don't feel comfortable doing it, but I'd probably take a whack at it. But that, I didn't go to Harvard, so that would never happen.
Yeah, they do have quite the pipeline from
yes,
Lampoon.
Yes, they do.
Let's move into CrossGen, which has come up on a few other interviews. It was such an interesting, I guess now you look back on it and say almost experiment, which is, this true studio style comic imprint. I think it was Ron Mars that we talked to who said, you're sitting right next to the artist and you're coming up with your scripts and seeing it drawn, and it's all being done under the same roof. What was your experience like there? Did you enjoy that kind of studio type experience?
I loved every minute of it. I still miss it. I still miss my CrossGen office. I still miss seeing everybody every day. And it was cool. It was like a 24-hour operation because you had some artists who were uncomfortable with being overseen. So they simply wouldn't show up until after dark.
Oh, wow.
And, I was there quite a lot. It was like my second home. So weekends and evenings, a lot of times, we'd be hanging out. And to work that closely with your art teams, it was just a joy. Look at the books. We changed how American comics look because, nobody had ever seen that level of quality in production and stuff. And we went, all those years without a typo because of the system we would use for proofreading. All kinds of things, all kinds of innovations that happened at CrossGen. And it couldn't have happened unless we were in that environment, unless we were all in the same building together.
What was the proof, if it's not a proprietary secret, what was the proofreading system? I'm curious.
It's as simple as you have the team that worked on it, everybody to the colorist worked on it, sit together and read it. And then you would have like 5 or 6 people who weren't involved with the book sit together and read it page by page. So it kept, it's like an apple sorter. The more eyes that saw it, the more mistakes we caught. So that, because we didn't have any editors. Right. So this system replaced the editors, and it was more of a, I don't want to say committee because the work was already done. We were literally looking at the proofs before they go out. Yeah. But it was a more democratic way of doing it.
Yeah, I think that works, especially having some outside eyes that haven't worked on it. There's only so much you can catch when you're that close to the project.
Oh, it's amazing what you miss if you worked on it. Because you did it, your mind's filling in things that aren't there. So I know it happens to me when I write prose. It's like I'll proof the thing 3 times and then I'll send it to my nitpickers and they find hundreds of typos. It's like, how did I not see this? Because the typo
happened between the panels.
What's that?
Said it all happened between the panels.
That's it.
I'm wondering, because you've worked on so many big projects and so well known, is there a run or a series you worked on that you think is a little underappreciated that kind of gets overlooked? Because I know you get asked a lot of the questions about a lot of the big stuff, but other things that you've worked on that you kind of feel very proud of.
I think the most overlooked thing that I ever worked on was Joker, the Devil's Advocate. Okay. It was a hardcover graphic novel that Graham Nolan and I did, and we co-plotted it, and it was like our ultimate Batman Joker story. Right. And you hardly ever hear about it. I run into people all the time, oh, I love Batman, I'm a diehard fan, and I tell them about Devil's Advocate, and they never heard of it. I think the problem is because DC's marketing is peculiar in that there are certain books they hold in high esteem, and most of those books are from their past.
Gotcha.
They don't really regard any new material as worthy of a big marketing thing.
Right.
And so basically they marketed Joker's Devil's Advocate as, here's a book by the guys who do Detective every month. And, you know, not as an event. Not that I wanted to be lauded with praise or you know, oh, this is the work of geniuses or whatever. But it's like, well, this is a worthy Joker story.
Right.
And I know that because Graham and I worked on it.
Yeah.
And mostly because Graham was involved. Because Graham's like this Batman scholar. He knows everything about Batman that there is to know. And he helped me write the story. We wrote it together.
Right.
And we were, and the most pleasing thing about it was Archie Goodwin was our editor again. And Archie said, I started reading it and I thought, oh, I know how this is going to end. I know who the real killer is. And he says, and at the end, he says, it came as a total surprise to me. And I'm like, yes. So we did a Batman mystery story, you know, an actual detective story, which are so rare in the Batman canon. Right. And it was a mystery that worked. Yeah. Because we sweated it. I mean, Graham and I spent 3 days in Manhattan. We had our own summit, just the two of us, working the plot out in person. And yet it's never been reprinted, except in Europe. It's always in print in Europe. I just saw a new French edition of it, but here it's just utterly in the you know, the ash can of history.
Gee whiz!
Not after this episode.
Right. You know what? Watch the eBay price go up.
We're going to use that as our anchor promotion. I have one more question, and Oren may have a couple as well. I'm curious, maybe you don't get asked too much about this, but Prophet, the Extreme Studios book that I think you worked on for a little while. I think it ties back a little bit to, you know, inheriting Tim Drake as a character, you know, trying to research Spawn for the crossover. But what was, how much did you have to work with as a character? And then how much freedom did you have to kind of do whatever you wanted?
I had like total freedom. I don't know why they chose that book for me. And it's almost like a lot of the Image books. It was all about the art, not really about the story. Mm-hmm. And to me, a lot of times when you wrote for Image, at the end, the end product didn't resemble anything like what I wrote. You know? Because the emphasis was so much on art. And all I knew was that they wanted something really pretentious. Okay. And I'm not real good at pretentious. And so I began co-writing it with a friend of mine, Steve Downs. And eventually he ended up writing it himself because Steve is better at pretentious. And in a good way, like that sort of grandiose, mythic, iconic, you know, consciously operatic kind of story. Mm-hmm. And, but they didn't like the fact that it was no longer me on the book. So that relationship ended. But yeah, I don't remember a whole lot about it because it just wasn't my thing. It was one of those instances where I should have said no. Yeah. So,
you know, it struck me as a strange matchup, and that's why I wanted to ask about it. But yeah, it's hard to use, to your term, the invisible hand with the overly muscled and drawn characters of 90s Image.
Well, I mean, when Rob Liefeld was trying to convince me to do it, he would talk to me about how him and Stephen Platt had these long discussions about theology and philosophy and stuff like that. I was like, oh my God, what a nightmare it would be to be a fly on that wall. So I couldn't imagine, you know, it'd be like two philosophy major freshmen after their first beer. Now, why am I even listening to this?
I thought you were going to say the discussions were about the size of the shoulder pads.
Oh no, these were deep, man. These were deep discussions. They got into it late night, you know. I don't know. I pictured the two of them seated on either side of a campfire. You know?
Why are we here, man?
Yeah, exactly. Hey, did you know that God spelled backwards is dog?
But I gotta ask, what did you think about the artist rock star time period?
I think it's a tragedy looking back, because they had the comics world by the short hairs, and they were extraordinarily successful, but they didn't build on it. They just did imitations of what they were doing at Marvel and DC. They could have revolutionized comics with the sales they had and the money that was pouring in. They should have done more outreach to find new readers, and explored other genres, because they had the money to do it. They had the capital to do it. I mean, I know guys in crowdfunding now who are doing that. Yes, my crowdfunding projects are really popular. Now I'm going to reach out to new audiences, expand my base. And Image never did anything to expand their base. They just appealed to kids at the time, and kids did like it. I know from going to the conventions. I mean, the reason why the conventions were packed is because of Image, and it was kids, but kids outgrow stuff, and they outgrew the stuff pretty quickly because there wasn't a lot there. I mean, I would read issues of Image comics and realize that you could switch all of these word balloons around and it would have the same result. It's like the writing wasn't, and they had these discussions. There was this famous debate between Peter David and Tom McFarlane of what was more important, writing or art. And it's like, you morons, they're both important. It's comics, it's words and pictures. One isn't more important than the other. They have to work together, but they created this animosity. And, eventually they had to bring writers in to save them. I mean, Todd had to bring in Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman to basically make his universe make sense to the reader. I'm sure to Todd it made perfect sense, but it wasn't getting across the reader. And then I was brought in Wildstorm to do a lot of their military stuff because they didn't have anybody that could write about that stuff convincingly. Right. So, but I think it was a missed opportunity. I think they could have built on it, because it was a golden age because they were lifting all boats with their sales. Everybody's sales were up because of Image. Right.
And there was a lot of money, but not much maturity, I think.
Well, when they began soliciting books and then waiting to see what the sales were like to start them, that was the end, because it was all about money. It was like, well, if this isn't going to sell 1 million copies, we're not even going to bother doing it.
Right.
So that's like what happened with Mike Grell with Shaman's Tears. Like, he was doing, I think good writing for it, but I guess they didn't figure it wasn't selling, up to their standards. So it just got dropped.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, and they were all chasing animation deals and things like that. I mean, and toys, and which is great, but bring in some writers. Have the stories make sense, have the characters be likable, think about a continuity, and then think about building on it, not just doing more and more superheroes.
I have one last question for you, and that is, speaking of art, whose art captured your words the best?
I'm going to make every artist angry if I start making a list.
That's the standard answer.
Yeah, it depends on what I was doing. I mean, on Conan, Gary Kwapis, he's my most frequent collaborator. Right. Nobody better. Right. Graham on Batman, nobody better. Right. I mean, I had to convince DC to hire him. Well, we're not sure he's right for it. What do you mean he's not right for it? The guy's a Batman scholar. Right. And but there's lots of, Jorge Zafino. I mean, just, a lot of artists inspired me to do work. Jorge Zafino, Flint Henry, Rodolfo DiMaggio, they would inspire me to write stories I normally wouldn't have written. That's awesome. But I've worked with so many incredible, talented guys and women. It's just amazing.
That's awesome. Well, your bibliography, I should say, is absolutely amazing too. And the work that you've done for us comic fans, we just can't thank you enough, because it's the comics we grew up with, and it's what made us fans. So thank you so much, sir.
Hey, I'm a fan too, and trust me, none of it was work. It was never a job.
That's awesome. That's what it's got to be. You got to love it.
Yeah, seriously. It ain't worth doing if you don't love it.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. That was our interview with Chuck Dixon. A real pleasure. I'm sorry I missed this one. When I heard that you guys are going to be interviewing him, I was really kicking myself. He's been a part of so many great stories and characters over the years. I mean, first and foremost comes to mind, obviously, Batman, and certainly his work on Robin.
Very fun interview to do. Very open, very honest guy. Talked a lot about his thoughts on the industry, and just pleasure to speak to. We'd love to have him back.
Prolific writer, one of the most ubiquitous writers of the era that we were all collecting in the 90s, especially on Batman. So it was a real pleasure talking to Chuck, and like we say with a lot of other guests, hopefully we have him back. But that'll do it for Dollar Bin Bandits for this week. We will see you next time. Peace.